customary for a speaker chair who self-designates as a guest speaker to do a classification talk. But in looking over my life, I decided that some of my dead relatives were a hell of a lot more interesting than I am. So I decided against a classification talk. Instead, I decided to talk about one of them instead. By the way, the speaker last week I thought was excellent. Good job, Jeff and Adrian. I learned more about Maine real estate, I think, in one shot than I thought possible. It was terrific. Anyway, so as you know, my wife Luann writes history books, and she's had a number of them published by the History Press. So she's had quite a bit of success in that, and she kind of inspired me to go ahead and try to write one myself. The difference is that her history books get published, whereas mine will not be published, because I'm writing about my family, and in particular, the central character in the story is my great-grandmother. And in the course of researching her, I started finding out more about her father, who would be my great-great-grandfather, a gentleman named Moses Sims. And his story is a lot shorter than his daughter's, so I'm going to tell you about him instead. Here's a picture of Moses Sims. As you can see, all of my ancestors look like a cross between Abraham Lincoln and the Frankenstein monster. So they all kind of look like that. Anyway, I want to give a little bit of background before I jump into the Civil War. I'm going to talk a little bit, give you a little bit of history that will help you understand the context for what was happening, because my great-great-grandfather, like many folks who fought in the Civil War, was always kind of buffeted by events, political events, and other historical events, economic events, and so on, that kind of shaped their lives. We wonder how much self-determination we have when we're living in a pandemic. It seems like that's been taken away from us to a degree, but I think when you start reading about what some of the folks in rural Maine encountered in the Civil War era and shortly thereafter, you suddenly feel much better about our own situation. You decide that a pandemic, for as horrible as it was, is not quite what they had to endure. So first of all, by way of background, in the North, unlike the South, you could actually buy your way out of service. Both the North and the South during the Civil War had a draft. They had conscription, but in the North, you could actually buy your way out. You could not in the South, which meant that a lot of wealthy Northerners simply went out and purchased a proxy. It was a very common event. Maine, being a relatively impoverished state at the time, for all the famous reasons, poor soil, short growing season, and just rocky, climate that was unpredictable with very early frost and so on. Maine was already a primarily agrarian but impoverished state. So younger Mainers who were drafted into the war could not afford to hire proxies. So there was a rather high service rate amongst younger Mainers. In the case of my great-great-grandfather, he was older. He was quite old for a recruit. He was in his middle 30s. He actually enlisted, and he enlisted for one reason only, which was poverty. And I'll tell you that those are the two major reasons why, if you dig into it, why Mainers in such numbers ended up serving in the Civil War. Per capita, very high number. It's a combination of simply needing the money and also not being able to afford your proxy. And so I'm sure a lot of you have Civil War ancestors, and maybe if there's time in the end, I'd love to hear about who you have in your family. But if you have deep roots in Maine, you're almost definitely going to have some Civil War veterans amongst your ancestors. In any event, the ancestor I'm going to talk about, Moses Sims, and his wife. His wife was Elizabeth Ellis. They were living in Canton, Maine. They were, like many young couples, they were living with their 2 children on her parents' farm. So they're on the Ellis farm in Canton. So they had 2 children. She was pregnant with her third. She died in childbirth, giving birth to her third child. This was my great-grandmother. And this was, the death of the mother or the child was very, very common in those days, because especially in rural Maine, like Canton was rural Maine, as it is today, often there was no doctor in attendance, and that was the case. My great-great-grandmother died the day after she gave birth to her daughter. The carnage among my main lineal ancestors in terms of childbirth was terrific. I've in the 2 generations before my own mother, there were 2 dead mothers and 9 dead newborns. So this was a very, very common phenomenon. I've always thought that if we take down all of the Civil War statues of failed Confederates, we should probably replace them with monuments to all the women who died in childbirth during the Civil War, because they're not recognized for their mortality rate was extremely high, and they received actually no recognition for that. Anyway, so Moses' wife Elizabeth died the day after birthing their third child. So my great-grandmother came into being when my great-great-grandfather went out of it. Elizabeth's death created a crisis for Moses, his new infant, and his 2 other children for 2 reasons. First, he now had a newborn that needed tending. And secondly, Elizabeth had been one of 11 Ellis children. So the Ellis farm, there was a lot of competition over the Ellis farm. With Elizabeth gone, Moses needed someone desperately to look after the newborn and his 2 other young children. And so, as often happened in those very pragmatic days, he quickly remarried. His new wife then became pregnant with his 4th child, and they could not remain on their in-laws' farm, which was far too small to accommodate Moses, his new wife, and his 4 young children. He had to find a new place for his family to live. He did have a skill as a leather worker. There was a small leather works in Canton, but there 2 things happened during the Civil War. First of all, people were leaving; they were going into service, so there was less demand. It was a real drag on the rural economy and leather making in general, and so there were just too many leather workers in Canton for Moses to support himself. However, leather workers were heavily recruited by the Union Army, and in particularly, the Union Army needed cavalry. Cavalry obviously needed horses. They needed a horse for every mounted soldier, and they need 12 horses to pull a cannon. Pull a small howitzer cannon that was of this type that was used in the cavalry. These military horses needed harnesses, and they needed bridles, they needed reins, they needed saddles, and so the Union Army was in desperate need of leather workers. who could make, fit, and repair all of these leather items. So the Union Army dangled $500 in front of Moses Sims. That was enough to buy a small farm. So he enlisted, despite being of relatively advanced age. He left his new wife. They'd only been married for a short time. He left his 4 children, and he reported to Company M in the 2nd Maine Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. Now, the Federal War Authority, they could have sent Moses and the other members of the 2nd Maine Cavalry to join the Army of the Potomac. That would actually have made sense. But in its collective wisdom, the military authority packed Moses and the other Mainers off to the very deepest South. Bad idea. As you know, Mainers do not do well in the heat. They have no way of cooling their bodies. It reminds me of coaching every year I used to coach the 4th of July All-Star game at Hippick Field, Little League All-Star game. It would always be 90 degrees. It would always be bright, hot sun. I'd always put some kid out in the left field. And before the inning was over, they'd be on life support. So it was, as you know, that's sending a whole bunch of rural Mainers down to the Gulf. The Southern Gulf was a bad idea. They went from cool or cold northern New England to the hellacious roaring furnace of the Southern Gulf. Instead of black flies and the flu, they now had heat stroke, yellow fever. They were under constant attack from deadly jumbo airborne mosquitoes that were packed to the gills with massive amounts of malaria. In the Louisiana Bayou, the 2nd Cavalry would go out on patrol. They'd overheat and they'd start dropping out of their saddles before anyone had a chance to shoot at them. So things went from bad to worse, because then they were sent, the Maine 2nd Cavalry was sent on the Red River campaign. This was a completely pointless fiasco. It's worth a book by itself, and indeed there have been books written about the campaign. And so it accomplished absolutely nothing, and there was a high attrition rate, both from disease and from combat. So at that point, after the Red River campaign, they took whoever in this Maine 2nd Cavalry who was still alive, and they sent them to Florida. This was an apparent attempt by the Northern War Authority to actually finish them off. By the time they rolled into Florida, so many Maine horsemen were suffering from what the Army surgeons diagnosed as, and this was pretty well reserved for Mainers, it was called sickness incident to acclimation. There were so many dying from sickness incident to acclimation that actually the problem came to the attention of the Federal Surgeon-in-Chief of Cavalry, Department of the Gulf, way back in his post in Washington, D.C. So he directed the 2nd Cavalry's attending surgeon to determine and report back to him why they were losing so many Mainers of non-combat injuries and disease, what might be done about it, and how many of them might still be capable of wartime activities. Well, Moses at this point had managed to survive Louisiana, the Red River campaign, and he was stationed along with his Company M of the Maine 2nd Cavalry, and in Fort Barrancas, which is on the Florida Panhandle. He was under command. Interestingly enough, his CO was Major Nathan Cutler from Farmington, who Paul Mills can tell you all about. Fascinating guy. And they were assigned, Moses and Company M of the Maine 2nd Cavalry, under the command of Major Cutler, were assigned to take part in a raid on the Confederate town of Mariana on the Florida Panhandle. Mariana, Florida, at the time was one of Florida's largest towns. It was where Florida's secessionist governor actually lived and worked, and where he conspired against the Union. Mariana was also an important Confederate supply hub that needed to get shut down. So Moses and Company M, they made their way to Mariana. They were the Company M was the only company, and then there were three people from Canton, including Moses, in Company M. They were the only company that actually brought a howitzer with them for whatever reasons. They managed to drag a howitzer, a small cannon, with 12 horses all the way from Fort Brancas. Moses and Company M, when they arrived in the outskirts of the town, they promptly were ordered to charge into the town, which they dutifully did. They charged headlong into downtown Mariana, where they were promptly ambushed by the Home Guard and some Confederate militia. Major Cutler from Farmington was actually shot off his horse. Some Confederate prisoners were taken, and Moses and a few others were ordered to march the Confederate prisoners south of the town to kind of hold them, because the town still had to be secured. There was going to be a lot of house-to-house fighting, and of course, pillaging and looting, all things you do when you're raiding a town. So Moses and the other guards marched their Confederate captives to what seemed to be a quiet spot in the woods about 1.5 miles south of the town. So they were kind of sitting around getting acquainted with each other, because the guards were they had chosen a different guard from different companies. So they're sitting around getting acquainted with each other. They're getting acquainted with their Confederate prisoners. When suddenly some Confederate cavalry burst into the clearing. Bad luck. Moses and his fellow guards, there were only half a dozen of them, had absolutely no time to react. The tables were quickly turned, and Moses and his fellow guards went from being the guards to the guarded. They were all captured. After a forced march of several days in rebel custody, Moses and his fellow prisoners were taken across the state line into Georgia, and they were dropped off at a clearing in the woods near a small town in very rural Georgia. This clearing was enclosed by a 15-foot-high stockade fence. A month before Moses's arrival, 33,000 federal prisoners of war had been confined there. A fellow prisoner described what new arrivals like Moses and his 2nd Cavalry mates saw when they were led into what was called and has become known as Andersonville Prison. So I'm going to read what this Northern soldier, as he was led into the prison, this is what he saw. As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons, covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, "Can this be hell?" God protect us. And all thought that God alone could bring them out alive from so terrible a place. In the center of the whole stockade was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. Many prisoners were dying every day. Their bodies were thrown into shallow trenches. The creek that was the only source of drinking water also served as the latrine. It was filled with waste from thousands of dead and dying prisoners. The prisoners were always begging for more food, and many were only half clad. The living prisoners competed violently with each other for what little food and shelter there were. Dead prisoners were quickly stripped of anything useful. Diarrhea, malaria, lice, scurvy, dysentery, gangrene, typhus, and hookworms were rampant. Already injured or ill, new arrivals died quickly, often during their first night in the camp. Any dazed prisoner who crossed the poorly marked dead line that was 19 feet from the stockade fence was shot dead. Men who thought they had already seen all forms of human suffering were overcome. Even war-hardened Southern Army medics summoned to help with the prisoners could only withstand 1 day's work in the stockade. So that was Andersonville Prison, which was now Moses's new home. It has the distinction of being the most deadly prison in U.S. history. It's fair to say that it was the closest thing to hell our country has ever devised. It earned its commandant the distinction of being only one of 2 rebel officers to be hung for war crimes at the conclusion of the Civil War. I'm going to digress a bit to explain exactly why Andersonville Prison was so bad. Because I think you have to get the big picture to fully understand the situation that Moses and his fellow 2nd Cavalry mates were confronted with. In the beginning, it had a lot to do with politics, and later it became an integral part of Northern war strategy. During the first 2 years of the Civil War, this would be 1861 to 1863, the war was fought with chivalry on both sides. It was a gentleman's war, so to speak. There was no need for permanent prison camps. For those first 2 years, when enemy soldiers were captured by either side, they were exchanged for friendly soldiers, thought to be a win-win, or they were simply paroled. In other words, like let go if they promised not to rejoin the army. So being captured wasn't so bad. But then something changed. President Lincoln discovered, to his great dismay, that the Southern authorities were not paroling or exchanging the North's African American soldiers. Captured Northern African American soldiers were being enslaved or re-enslaved instead. So Lincoln immediately ordered an end to all parole and prisoner exchange unless and until the South changed its mind about its treatment of African American soldiers. This was Lincoln's War Order number 252. Well, Order 252 did not actually free any African American prisoners. The South simply flatly refused to compromise the same racist values that had caused it to go to war in the first place. So Order 252 essentially trapped captured soldiers north and south of the border. With the end of the prisoner exchanges, the end of paroles, suddenly these captured soldiers had to stay put, and they had to be held by their captors. So makeshift prison camps like Andersonville were hastily constructed. Prison populations exploded on both sides of the border. Order 252 essentially trapped 195,000 federal soldiers in the South, and it trapped 215,000 Confederate soldiers in the North. Order 252 also aggravated the situation for every prisoner like Moses Sims south of the border, because after Order 252, the South simply felt that, well, whatever whatever happens to these guys, whatever horrors befall these Northern prisoners now, it's not our fault. It's the horrors, the responsibility lays with Lincoln and the North due to its unilateral discontinuance of the prisoner exchange and parole programs. That was the South's twisted logic. So this is the orders in 1863. Well, by the time a couple more years of fighting in 1865 rolled around, the Confederacy started to run out of able-bodied soldiers. The Confederate authorities saw in the thousands of rebel prisoners held in the North the soldiers they wished they had to continue their war effort. So finally, out of pure military desperation, the Confederate authorities caved in. They offered to include African American troops in prisoner exchanges. But by this time, the game had changed. Lincoln had U.S. Grant as General-in-Chief of the Union Army, and Lincoln made it Grant's call as to how to respond to the South. Grant's call was to continue the freeze. He did this purely as a matter of war strategy. By 1864, for Grant, war meant total war. The South's military and humanitarian obligation to clothe, board, and guard these 200,000 Union prisoners might consume resources that the South could otherwise use to prolong the war. So Grant thought that the more heavily the Great Rebellion's resources were taxed, the sooner the rebellion could be put down. So, and there was now even another aggravating circumstance as far as Moses and his 2nd Cavalry mates at Andersonville are concerned. By the time of Moses's capture in 1864, the Confederate Army was ill-clad, barefoot, sick, and starving. The Confederate Army in 1864 was essentially under siege. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Rail lines had been cut. Farms had been destroyed. The entire blockaded population of the South, because as you know, the North had a complete sea blockade of all the Confederate ports. The entire blockaded population of the South was going hungry. There was nothing left for prisoners of war like Moses Sims, so they basically were neglected and starved. So getting back to this, that's the political and historical situation that created such an atrocity at Andersonville, along, of course, with their commandant, who was deservedly hung. When General Sherman's Union Army, as you know, Sherman was occupied and burned Atlanta, and then he was working his way to the sea. So he's in Georgia, not that far from Andersonville. So when his Union Army got too close for comfort, Moses and the other Andersonville prisoners were taken to Camp Lawton. This was a hastily constructed Georgia stockade prison. Lawton was more sanitary. It was twice as large as Andersonville. At the time, it was in fact the largest prison in the world. The water supply was better. The deadline was better marked, so fewer prisoners were shot. But Moses was only held there for a month. Once again, Sherman's cavalry got close to Lawton. So Moses and 10,000 other prisoners at Camp Lawton were transferred out of the camp near the end of November 1864. Only 4 days before Sherman's cavalry arrived, so that my great-great-grandfather missed being rescued at Camp Lawton by 4 days. The cavalry, after taking a look around and seeing the putrid conditions and the dead that had been left behind at Camp Lawton, the cavalry burned the camp to the ground. When the Confederates emptied Camp Lawton, Moses was apparently in some kind of administrative screw-up, and I've been looking at prison records along with my cousin, trying to figure out exactly what happened, but somehow Moses became separated from his second cavalry mates, and Moses was actually sent northward, whereas the rest of the second cavalry prisoners were sent southward. After multiple train rides north, this is just before they managed to get Moses north just before Sherman cut the final rail lines connecting the southern rural Georgia and the Carolinas. After multiple train rides north and a forced march, Moses arrived at a new prison known as Florence Prison in South Carolina. Well, if Moses was hoping that Florence would be a step up from Andersonville, he was severely disappointed. It was virtually the same thing as Andersonville on a smaller scale. It must have had the same architect and landscape designer. Like Andersonville, it was a stockade prison with 16-foot walls surrounding it. The deadline was poorly marked, and to quote one of Moses's fellow inmates, quote, "Much of the deadline was just where the guards chose to claim it. They differed as to its location, and many prisoners lost their lives because of this difference of opinion." The stockade had its own swamp, just like Andersonville, and 12,000 inmates occupied 7 acres of usable ground. Like Andersonville, it had a stream running through the middle of it that doubled as the camp latrine and the water supply. An aggravating circumstance was that Moses was dropped off at this place in November of 1864, which meant that winter time was coming. Winter in Florence, South Carolina is not quite the same as fall in South Georgia. When you're living without adequate shelter in a completely open area, exposed to the elements around the clock, the rainy season and colder weather are absolutely deadly. The prisoners were thin, famished, and in rags or nearly naked. Many were without blankets. They lived in unheated, improvised shelters. Some were so weak they only had the strength to dig a shallow hole in the ground they could back into. They were cold all of the time. Hands and feet grew gangrenous and rotted off. A prisoner who, like Moses, had been held at both Andersonville and Florence. And that's one reason I was able to, by following some other prisoners who were with Moses, I was able to, some of them wrote about these things, which is where I can get my information. It was a wonderful source of information. So one of the prisoners who had been at Andersonville like Moses and had been transferred to Florence like Moses wrote, quote, "There was never a moment in the day or night that we were free from cries of agony. I will not attempt to tell the horrors of this Florence prison. Only I will say that the human misery was greater than at Andersonville Many were murdered at the deadline. The gangrene was terrible, and many died from sheer starvation. So by this time of the war, this is now February 1865, and Moses is at Florence prison. By this time, the South was nearly beaten. And with rumors circulating about federal prisoners possibly suffering south of the border, General Grant decided it was time to renew the prisoner exchange. The Florence prisoners were split into two groups, those who were the most alive and those who were the least alive. Those with the most life in them were dispatched towards Camp Parole, Annapolis, Maryland. Moses was put in the other group, which was the group of those who were most desperately ill. The months of exposure, unsanitary conditions, disease, and privation had taken their toll. By this time, Moses was in tough shape. He left Florence prison on a train bound for freedom on March 1st, 1865, as part of the infamous Cape Fear prisoner exchange. There's a really interesting article written by an historian about the Cape Fear prisoner exchange, about how these, when the South, when the exchange program was reinstituted by Grant, the South did not hold back. They could not clothe, house, feed all these prisoners, so they released everybody. Anything that was still alive got loaded onto a train and sent to the exchange places. We don't know if Moses was conscious when his train passed through the federal picket line to Union-held ground. Some of his fellow passengers were, and they tried to cheer. The Confederate guards on the train were scared. They thought they might be shot when the bluecoats saw the condition of their prisoners. Moses had to be carried off the train when it arrived in Wilmington, South Carolina. And Wilmington, South Carolina had just been occupied by the Union Army, so they were not equipped for the city had been laid under siege. They were short on supplies. The hospitals were already nearly full, and there's no way they could accommodate trainload after trainload after trainload, thousands of dead and dying prisoners were being dropped off in a city that had just been occupied by the Union Army. So Moses had to be carried off the train when it arrived. He stayed alive all the way to hospital number 4. He managed to stay alive for 6 days. Thereafter, he died a free man on March 7th, 1865. The hospital record does not give a cause of death. Basically, he had just given out. Moses had died of everything and nothing. He was placed in a shallow, temporary grave to be dug up later when there was time for a decent burial. Ultimately, he was buried in the National Cemetery in Wilmington, North Carolina. And here's his gravestone in the National Cemetery. So that's all I have. It's not a very, I guess it's not a very uplifting story, to say the least, but it certainly has, I guess it should make us feel a little bit better about our lives anyway.